Well, welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you all here. We're excited to see such a big group here to learn about the Farm Bill. My name is Alyssa Munoz. I'm the Executive Director of the New Orleans Food Policy Action Council, and we are a New Orleans-based policy and systems change organization.
And hey everyone, I'm Emily Mickley Doyle. I'm with Sprout NOLA, and we work to support growers of all kinds in New Orleans and beyond. And I am here as a policy student with Vermont Law School in food and ag law and policy. And Sprout and FPAC are working together on talking about how Louisiana can get in here and organizing for the Farm Bill for 2023.
Yeah, so you'll notice that we have an ag group and then sort of more of a larger food systems nutrition group. This is on purpose. As you'll learn, the Farm Bill encompasses a lot, but the main things that it encompasses are nutrition and sort of farming. And what ends up happening in a lot of these discussions is mirroring what the discussions in the food system in general, which is kind of this perceived dichotomy of getting as many people fed as cheaply as possible and supporting farmers. And people see this as incompatible, and we believe it's not. We believe that these two things are inextricably linked, and that we can do both, and we can do both in a good and sound farm bill. So we're hoping that this small coalition is kind of a model of what we want our farm bill work and the farm bill to look like moving forward.
Yep, and thanks to all the other Sprout and FPAC folks who are doing so much tech and management on the back end. Devin, Margie, Haley, thank you all for helping manage all of this. What couldn't happen without you. Also, Britt.
Great. So if you all will introduce yourselves in the chat with your name and organization, if that's applicable, you might just be here as an interested person, and we love that. Also, please mute yourself. If something happens and you accidentally take yourself off mute, we will kindly remute you for yourself. If you have a question, please either use the chat or use the raise your hand in the reactions. And if you're not sure how to do that, let us know in the chat and we'll show you how you can do that. We will have a chance throughout for questions, and then at the end, and any questions that we can answer in the chat, we will do so. The learning portion of this will be from 11 to 12, and then we're hoping at 12 that you'll be able to stay so that we can really begin organizing and digging into how we can together advocate for a sound and equitable farm bill. Chat is open and will be monitored. I love an active chat room. So that sounded weird, but I love an active chat. So please, feel free to share links in the chat. We'd love to see that. What is the Farm Bill? That's why we're all here. The Farm Bill is a massive omnibus, which means it is a multi-year authorizing legislation that governs a whole mess of things. It governs a lot of agriculture and food programs. The Farm Bill is really kind of as bipartisan as you can get for a bill, because it has to pass. Everybody has to vote on it. So to get to a farm bill, everybody really has to work together, but it's very tenuous. The working together is tenuous because it's seen as one pie. And, if nutrition gets a bigger slice, then commodities gets a smaller slice. As we said, that's what we often see and feel in the food system. And we know that both can be true. We can have enough support for people to eat nutritious food, and for farmers to grow that nutritious food in a way that sustains them.
Great. So as Alyssa outlined, the Farm Bill encompasses so much of our food system. It's growing and eating. It's also international trade. It's a giant bill. And it's sometimes feels like it's linked together and sometimes feels like it's very disparate. But we really like this quote from NSAC that gets to the spirit of the bill. The Farm Bill connects the food on our plates, the farmers and ranchers who produce that food, and the natural resources or soil, air, and water that make growing food possible. So that's kind of the spirit of what we'd like to see our Farm Bill look like. And to that end, we know that there are folks who are coming from their agriculture sector, from the nutrition sector, and then just other folks who are generally interested in the Farm Bill in a wider sense. So in order for us both to know how best to get in touch with you later and your interests, and also because we're going to be doing these breakout rooms that are more interest group related later on in the webinar, we'd really like for you to take a second to either to rename in your chat, have your name and then a dash, and then write if you're A for agriculture, if that's your interest in the Farm Bill, or N for nutrition, or G for general, depending on where you're coming from and what you'd like to talk more about. So we'll take a second here in the chat for you to please rename where your interest lies.
And if you have any trouble doing that, feel free to drop it in the chat, or if you're on the phone, and someone from our amazing tech team will help rename you. Great. I love seeing so many people with so many different interests. Okay, so as we've said over and over, the Farm Bill is huge. It is only renewed every 5 years, and it is a massive spending bill. So for the 2018 Farm Bill, which was the last Farm Bill, so every 5 years means that in 2023 we have to reauthorize the Farm Bill. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, projected that it would cost $428 billion for the last Farm Bill. We know that that spending has increased significantly because COVID was not on the horizon when we passed the 2018 Farm Bill. So I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but I believe it's gone over by about $1 billion. But so that you know sort of where that money and is going, 76% of that large number makes up the nutrition section, which is mostly SNAP benefits. And then all the rest is farming. And 1% is the other category. And that's where a lot of the things that we feel are important in agriculture, regenerative agriculture, and fruits and vegetables, that all fits into the 1%. So it's a very small portion of the Farm Bill, but it's so important. And I also want to give some context that when we say small, 1% of $430 billion is still a lot of money. But it's not nearly enough. But like we said, it's massive and covers so much and costs so much money.
So in 2018, this omnibus bill has so many chapters to it. And as you can see, this kind of breaks down what we mean by omnibus, right? And we have 12 chapters, at least in 2018. If this changes in our new draft, it might look completely different than this, but we're only going by our history. But in 2018, these were the 12 chapters. Alyssa's already talked a little bit about Title IV, nutrition, but as you can see, so much about farming, conservation, forestry, and nutrition is in this bill. And we're going to talk more extensively about this in later slides and get more into detail about it. But as we saw in the last title, or the last slide, 4 titles account for 99% of Farm Bill outlays that are mandatory. So that's nutrition in Title IV, crop insurance in Title 11, farm commodity support, which is Title I. Commodities is a giant part of this bill, and then conservation, which is Title II. So we're really focusing in on some of these additional titles, and we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, and one thing that I haven't said yet is that while the Farm Bill does include a lot with our food and farming system, it doesn't include everything. So some of the things that aren't included in the Farm Bill are farm and food workers, rights and protections, public land grazing rights, irrigation water rights, the FDA or the Food and Drug Administration's food safety and food standards, tax issues around food, school meals, WIC, and GMO labeling. So are all not included in the Farm Bill. Those are all in different pieces of legislation. So how is it passed? Like we said, it's huge. So it takes a lot of different steps to pass it. First is the reauthorization phase, which is kind of the like law phase. Then there's the appropriations, which is the money. And then there's the rulemaking, which is the doing. And every one of these phases is equally as important. We'll talk about why as we get into them, but just we're not done once a farm bill is passed. There's a lot more work to be done to make sure that the farm bill that is passed is fairly and equitably implemented. It's very complicated, as you can see, on how it is reauthorized. We are in step one. We're actually in kind of like step A1. We're not even quite to step one. So first a draft will come out. Each house will have their own draft. We are waiting for those drafts right now, but a year, 2 years, 5 years goes into getting these drafts together. So there's marker bills that come out. There's been a lot of hearings, especially in the last 6 months. You may have heard about a lot of farm bill hearings, and that's where they're gauging interest and seeing what people want to see in a farm bill. And so that all goes into step one. And then step two is where they have their drafts. So those should be coming up soon. We are in a midterm year, as most of you all probably know, a really, really important midterm year. And so we're hearing conflicting reports, or I am, and I'd love if anyone else has any other intel on whether or not the draft will come out before the midterms to help influence the midterms, or will come out after the midterms, because then we'll sort of know more about what what the government and legislative branch looks like, and what the farm bill will look like. So a farm bill in a midterm year is a more complicated beast. And in every single one of these steps, there is like so much back and forth and negotiating and talking and sending it back. So after the drafts happen and all the conversation, then they are voted on by their respective floors, goes to a joint committee where then they do a lot more negotiating, a lot more talking to try to make both houses happy. Then that one is brought back to each house, and more negotiating, more talking, more mucking around. And then it's brought back for a final full vote, and then sent to the president's desk, where hopefully in all that talking and back and forth, they have talked to the president, so we don't have any surprise vetoes. But it's really hard to tell, especially this year. So that's the reauthorization phase. Was that sort of clear as mud? We do have someone in the House Ag and Appropriations Committee, because a lot of these first things happen in committee. We have Julia Letlow, who is in the House committees. Last time we had Kennedy, and we actually got a lot done. We'll talk about that a little further in, but we worked closely with his office and got a lot done. And so we're hopeful that we can this year. I'm not sure we'll be quite as easy and friendly, but it doesn't mean we're not going to do it.
Yeah, and I would also encourage folks who don't live in Louisiana, who are tuning in from adjacent states and other places in the Gulf South, to check what their House Ag and Senate House committees and Ag committees are, and if you have anybody on those that's the most influential of anyone, especially Senate Ag Committee is incredibly influential in getting this passed, and we'd love to be able to keep talking together about how we may join in solidarity to get some things passed with those committees.
Okay, so it's passed, the big thick farm bill. The president has signed it. We're done, right? Oh no, we're not done. now's the, I want to say they're really important. They're all really important, but now's the money. And the money kind of goes through all the same processes of both floors have to vote on it, and there's a budget, and it's it can be tough, again, because of that nutrition versus farming sort of dichotomy that everyone believes exists, but we know doesn't necessarily have to. And there's two kinds of funding in the Farm Bill. There's mandatory funding and discretionary funding. As you can see, mandatory funding takes up 99% of the money. Discretionary is 1% of the spending in this. And so spending levels are a huge debate in all of these things. Many of the regenerative ag programs are in this little discretionary, so it's not a lot of money and it can go unfunded. And we know that an unfunded program is an unsuccessful program. So the appropriations phase is really, really important to make sure that they are allocating money to the things that we think are important. Em, do you want to add to this?
That's great. I was just
Okay.
going to add that, yeah, I think that appropriations can be really difficult for innovative programs, as especially thinking about that when we're trying to brainstorm what our next steps are in organizing. That doesn't, again, mean that it's impossible. It's just something that we need to watch out for. And the climate around this is that legislators often see this as a zero-sum game, that if appropriations are coming for one thing, then it's going to take away from something else. And this is a pretty entrenched system over decades and decades, especially around farm commodities and direct payments to farmers. So it's just something to watch out for when we're talking with legislators about what we're asking for, and coming up with solutions that are both and not necessarily zero-sum language.
Thank you. All right, so the farm bill's passed, the money's figured out, and so now we're done, right? Not so fast. Now we have the rulemaking, which is where the stuff actually kind of really happens. That's when the programs get started. That's a lot of hurry up and wait. So two examples that I wanted to talk about is updating the Thrifty Food Plan, which is sort of on the nutrition side, if you will. That was voted on and passed in the 2018 Farm Bill, and it's just happening. So there's been a lot of work along the way, but as you can see, just because it happens in the Farm Bill doesn't mean that it immediately goes into effect. They have those full 5 years to work on it, and a lot of times it's up until the last few months that things are passed. And the same with hemp reclassification, which was a major ag portion of the last Farm Bill. And so some of that happened immediately, and some of it is still happening with lots of hearings and things like that.
Yeah, this harkens us back to the old, what was it, the Schoolhouse Rock videos about how a bill gets passed and moves through and becomes a law, how a bill becomes a law. So right now we're in the legislative branch, and then with building out the Farm Bill, and then it'll go in that appropriations will then be funding that's still in the legislative branch, but then it goes over to the executive branch, that's how the actual rulemaking and what are the specifics and the details. Like legislative branch talks generally what that program goals and outcomes should be, and then the agencies are the ones who are tasked to really look into that deeply and be the dotted I and cross the T's on how these programs get implemented.
Great, thank you, Emily. Yeah, this is sort of where the rubber hits the road on how things kind of shake out. You can say things but then actually doing them. Okay, so sort of going back is Well, I wonder, should we take a moment to see if anyone has any questions on the process so far?
I think that's great. Yeah,
Okay.
if anything's coming up for people about generally what's the farm bill and how does it generally move to law, that this would be a great time to check in about that. And we will acknowledge this is so confusing. And Alyssa's going to tell you later, like it was meant to be that way. And we're not experts on this. We're learning as we go. So there are no silly questions, truly.
No.
Pretty much, Bob. That's what we're getting. That storks fly the bill to Washington and it's born. That's kind of is yeah. Grace, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just have a quick question about, since y'all shared that example of one piece of the bill before that took, it still hasn't been implemented 4 years later. Is that so what we can anticipate with this essentially, like once it's passed, whatever happens next year, that it could be like, is there some timeline that they have to follow, or is it like it could just never, it takes 6 years, 7 years to implement something that passes next year?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Grace. And it's my understanding that, the legislation makes up, it's pretty much like the big ideas, people, right? And then they push that, once it goes through, they push that to the agencies, and then the agencies have to come up with their entire plans around how they're going to implement what the legislative process has asked them to do or charged them to do. So often it does take many years to be able to implement it. And there's not necessarily, I wouldn't say that there are hard and fast deadlines unless they're specifically stipulated in these bills. But yes, it can take some time. I think, Margie, I don't mean to put you on the spot, and if you want to pass, that's fine. But part of what our work around the urban and innovative agriculture work last year, because that was a completely new program. It's taking a lot of time to build out. And I'm wondering if you have any insight on like what that process has looked like for you in watching a completely new thing happen through an agency.
Yeah, well, first of all, if you guys need me to stop talking, because I am the only internet signal I could find is in a lobby that won't stop playing 90s music. Emily probably knows exactly where I am, but I'm happy to talk about that. Please let me know if it's impossible to hear me though. I would say it's been a real study in understanding how the Farm Bill works, from the ideas to implementation, and understanding like the true movement of bureaucracy. So like Emily was saying, through advocacy, I'll give a couple of steps to help illuminate it. So we worked on the 2018 Farm Bill having this urban and innovative agriculture program. And that part of what that would look like, the big picture structure that was designed, was that cities would begin to have their own urban county committees. The cities that would have those were not decided. That wasn't picked. It was just that they would start doing that. And the number of cities that would have that weren't even picked. Just the idea that that would happen was part of the Farm Bill. So after it passed, what then happened was that there was a decision to start that as a rollout of 15 cities at a time. There was no clear plan on how to get cities to be selected. And there wasn't a clear application process. So many cities just had to advocate to their legislators to ask if they could kind of run it up the pole to the USDA and see if anyone knew what they were talking about. New Orleans did end up being one of those cities. So then 2 years after that, we heard from Washington through a press release that we were one of those cities. And then we had to ask the questions of, so what does that mean? How does that council get elected? And there was no formal process for election. So then citizens had to kind of push and help design the election process. And and so then we had an election process and our members got selected. And I can give this very real world example that I was selected 1 year ago to be on the 3-person board for the first county committee for the city of New Orleans. And today at 1 o'clock, we will have our second meeting ever. And our first meeting was introducing ourselves to each other. So this is a piece of piece of policy that we pushed for in the winter of 2017. Am I right? Yeah, in the winter of 2017 in DC, we started talking about this. And now October 2022, we're having our second meeting, even though it was decided on in the winter of 2017. So it's a lot, but it does, but I want to like balance that by saying like it's both bureaucratic and completely confusing, and the sort of enforcement mechanism is completely different from the design mechanism. But at the same time, I hope that you hear that things do eventually happen. It just requires a lot of advocacy and a dogged amount of care and attention from community members like you guys.
Thank you for that, Margie. I think that's like a really beautiful example of how long that this can actually take to implement, but also why it's so important for us to not stop at the legislative process or just the appropriations process, but continue to follow this work all the way through to the agency level.
Yeah, Farm Bill work never ends. Because after it's passed, then you have to, one, start on the next one and start on the implementation and continue on the implementation. Were there any other questions? Grace, that was a great question. Thank you. Okay, well, if they come up for you, feel free to pop them in the chat. Okay, so when we were talking about phase one of the legislative part of this, I said marker bill, and I said it kind of offhandedly. So to unpack that, a marker bill is a standalone piece of legislation that's not actually intended to pass as a standalone piece of legislation. It's to gather support and to be incorporated into a larger farm bill, such as the Farm Bill.
Yeah, and so some of the marker bills that we're looking at right now that are beginning to emerge from this project is that, so they're out of here, like 5 of them: Agriculture and Resilience Act, Farmers Fighting for Climate Change, Justice for Black Farmers Act. There's a SNAP Options Act and a State Meat Inspection Meat and Poultry Act that we're looking at. And what this shows us is that there are some themes that are emerging that are important for folks in advocating for the next Farm Bill, especially around climate, racial equity, and SNAP technology. These are all resources, these marker bills, hopefully, we can keep following, advocating for, to be able to be rolled into our Farm Bill. And if you want more information on any of these marker bills, we're happy to send you along some article. Yeah, okay, great. We have, thanks, Danny, in the chat. We have additional marker bills for SNAP. And yeah, we're happy to send you along resources for any of those additional marker bills if you'd like to research further.
And I forgot to say at the beginning, but everyone who registered, which means everyone who's here, will be getting a copy of this presentation and some other, like an advocacy guide and some other things. So you will be able to go back and, if you're interested, look up some of these marker bills that are on the screen so you can get to know a little bit more about them. And thank you again, Danny. Okay, so we talked about how there's, nutrition makes up the largest piece of the Farm Bill, or pieces of the Farm Bill. There's a lot of nutrition stuff that's in here. The biggest one being the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. That makes up 76% of the funding and of the Farm Bill. So, and it can be, as we all know in this room, can be a little bit controversial, but it's a huge portion of the Farm Bill. Additionally, there is, this is all part of mandatory funding. SNAP is kind of direct to folks. The next few are more of emergency food, if you will. So there's the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is often known as TFAP. That's emergency food distribution that often goes through food banks. And that is provides food and funds to states to operate TFAP. Commodity Supplemental Food Program, the CSFP, which is food boxes for seniors who are 60. The USDA again gives both food and funding for that. That is what is often sometimes crudely known as commodity boxes or government boxes that are through partners and food banks. And then there's the Food Distribution Program on Indian reservations. And that provides, again, food and funding to operate the program. And that is for income eligible households living on Indian reservations, and Native American households residing in designated areas near reservations or in all of Oklahoma. And for these last three programs, the USDA gives both food and funding. And so that's where a lot of folks think that the nutrition program is, sort of against, if you will, the farming programs. But for each of these, they are buying this food from farmers, and then they are giving it to people. So that's where, while this money is under the nutrition program, it is a huge farming boon, if you will, as well, because they provide the food that often they buy through commodity program and crop insurance programs and programs like that to farmers, or they buy it from farmers to give to people. And then they additionally also give funding to the folks who do the programs to actually operate the programs on those. So while there's a lot that's covered in the nutrition title, excuse me, you'll notice that it's mostly emergency food. There's not a lot of childhood nutrition. So WIC is not in here, school food is not in here. And those are all covered in the child nutrition reauthorization, which we'll probably have a webinar on that. And that is supposed to be reauthorized often as well. It expired in 2010. And so we're hopeful it's also going through this year. But an example of how there are some things that, or an example of the difference is the Keep Kids Fed Act, which is that's a bill that has school lunches in it. And that is not Farm Bill related. Keep Kids Fed. Kids Eating Local, that is a Farm Bill related marker bill. And that's because that one is making it so that farm to school programs can buy from local growers. So it can get a little bit complicated when we're talking about the Farm Bill on what exactly is covered. So those are two sort of examples of how school food can be and cannot be covered through the Farm Bill.
Thanks, Alyssa. So now we're moving from nutrition focused programs in the Farm Bill to agriculture focused programs in the Farm Bill. Everything that Alyssa just covered was only under title, nutrition is Title 4 in the Farm Bill?
In the 2018 Farm Bill, it was, yes.
2018 Farm Bill is Title 4, but we're breaking this out a little further because a lot of the stuff that agriculture folks are interested in comes through a lot of different titles. So we didn't add in here the commodities title, mostly because we focus a lot more on small scale and specialty crops, but it's a really big part. It's not something to be left out of the conversation. It is the commodity crops, just to give a little background on, are crops that are large in value and high intensity. And they include corn, wheat, sorghum, barley, oats, rice, cotton, soybeans, some pulses, and peanuts. So basically what's happening, they have a different whole schema than other specialty crops, which we'll talk about in a second. But basically there are subsidies or direct payouts to have base acres and production on cropland that includes those. And then so that's Title 1 subsidies, which we don't really focus on. We focus on a lot of the rest of the titles that specialty crops touch. And specialty crops is everything else. I know that sounds probably silly because it's like all of the food that we eat. It's fruit and nut production, vegetables, herbs, flowers, nursery products, maple syrup, honey. That's all specialty crops. So we mostly focus on there are two slides, these titles, and then in the next slide. But Title 2, yeah, we can move back to the previous slide to 2. The conservation programs, I think a lot of farmers have some knowledge on, especially things like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, if there are any growers on this call who have gotten like an EQIP green high tunnel that's come through this program. There are a lot of opportunities for reform and kind of leaning into our conservation stewardship program, and as well as conservation easements, some larger regional partnership programs in conservation, and especially relevant to Louisiana is our Swamp Buster and Wetlands and Watersheds conservation program that's coming out of Title II. Title V is farm credit. We put it on here in 2018. Yes, this is all 2018 stuff, but we'll be looking forward to this, what comes out in the new draft in 2022. Farm credit is not necessarily, hasn't been a hugely accessible part of the Farm Bill for small scale producers, but we're putting these things in here as potential opportunities as well. Additionally, research extension and related matters, any of our land grant universities that are getting funds to do extension through like the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Extension Program, any growers on here who have been part of the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program, that's coming through Title VII in the Farm Bill. And then we can keep going to the next slide. The three additional titles that we're looking into are the horticulture, the crop insurance, and miscellaneous titles. Horticulture really covers all the National Organic Program, anything that's labeled organic in the US. There are specialty crop block grants that that help folks that have a little bit more flexibility in funding and how that's used. And this is where, when we started talking about local and innovative and urban production, that's under the horticulture title. Under that, the programs that are being facilitated through that title are the local ag marketing program, the farmers market promotion program, the local food marketing promotion program, and the value added producer grants. A lot of folks who may be on this call who work at farmers markets or have applied for grants under FMPP or LFMPP, those are coming through the Title X horticulture programs. Crop insurance, usually, historically, crop insurance has been very commodities focused. And we're really, over the past few farm bills, and I think moving into this new farm bill, we really want to be able to work towards protecting crops that are not falling under commodities. We have some right now, non-insured crop assistance program and microfarm whole farm revenue protection, but making those more accessible and easier to navigate, I think, is a potential win that we could have in the next bill, especially when we're here in the Deep South and we're having disasters and we're having other kind of climate crisis events happening. A lot of growers really need to be able to access support for growing under extenuating weather and climate circumstances. Additionally, and this is last but not least in the titles, this is a really important part of the miscellaneous of the Farm Bill, the miscellaneous section, especially because the Farming Opportunities Training and Outreach, or FOTO program, lives in the miscellaneous section. And this is the section where, as the USDA calls, socially disadvantaged farmers. So that's Black farmers, queer farmers, women farmers, I think veteran farmers are also counted under this. This is providing extra support and funding for folks who have been marginalized in agriculture. And that's the first time in 2018 this was all rolled together into one program. And I think we have a lot of opportunities to improve and to expand on that section of the Farm Bill in future times. Thanks, Devin. Lots of changes in crop insurance are happening and hopefully continue as far as inclusion of smaller scale producers. So in summary, we've got some pretty cool opportunities, I think, in ag. We have, and some of those themes that are beginning to emerge are around climate and conservation, as well as disaster response, racial equity, building support for small scale producers. And a thing that we haven't really brought into this much in this conversation is a lot of agricultural funding came through pandemic related programs and the Inflation Reduction Act. And we're really looking to try to solidify some of that funding for longer term use rolling over into the Farm Bill.
Great. And I realized that I forgot to add a slide on opportunities in the nutrition. And a lot of the things that Danny dropped in the chat, those links, we'll talk about this. And I apologize for leaving that off. But some of the opportunities that we have in the nutrition title are expanding online SNAP acceptance is a really big one, and just expanding technology around SNAP in both the acceptance of SNAP and then technology in the disbursement of SNAP. Also looking at some of the changes that happened during the pandemic relief, making those, solidifying them sort of like ag. So whether that's increased amounts and reduced barriers to getting SNAP. So all of the hoops that must be jumped through monthly to get SNAP are, looking at potentially lowering or doing away with those barriers. And then additionally, allowing more local food in schools. So, or allowing schools to have more flexibility on who they buy from for school food. So while school food, again, isn't part of the Farm Bill, not restrictions necessarily, but who schools can buy from is in the Farm Bill. And so there's a lot of potential movement on that in the 2023 Farm Bill. And I also want to say, now on to what's next and how to get involved. The 2023 Farm Bill just has to be passed by the end of 2023. So there is a lot of movement that will be going on throughout 2023. So it's going to be a busy next few years. And we are super excited to work with you all. Some things you can do right now while we sort of wait to see how the midterms shake out is keep an eye on marker bills. Look at some of the links that we put in the chat and some of the things that we'll send out. If you see something you like, reach out to your lawmaker and say, I really like this. I'd like for you to include it in the Farm Bill, or depending on lobbying versus advocacy and your nonprofit status, you can say that in however you need to say it. Sign up for our newsletter and alerts. I'm going to drop in the chat in just a moment an evaluation that we have that also will ask you if you would like to share your information and get more involved with the Farm Bill. Vote on November 8th in the midterms. I don't care who you vote for organizationally, like you do you, but vote. You need to do it. The midterms are hugely important. Pay attention to them, vote where you can. And a draft Farm Bill will be out soon. And so be on the lookout for that as well. And we will send information around about the draft Farm Bill and next steps. We're hoping to have a couple more webinars that will dig in deeper in nutrition, in ag, in the draft Farm Bill. So if that's something you're interested in, we'd love to get you plugged in.
Yeah, and additionally, with this voting on November 8th, I think what we're hearing is it's the difference on whether this can be a transformational Farm Bill or a do no harm Farm Bill. It's like, are we trying to really take big swings? Is that a possibility? Or are we just trying to hold the line on what wins we've gained so far? So it's always important to vote, and this really will impact what we're able to get done this time.
I dropped a link to our survey. It's both an evaluation survey because, we're nonprofits. We have to evaluate everything. It's how we continue to get our funding to do this really important work. And then it's also, would you like to get more involved? And how would you like to get involved? So we have some.
Sorry, Alyssa. Grace says she needs access to the doc.
Oh, okay. Okay. I will do that in just a second. I'm not sure if I can do that while I'm doing this. I probably can. I can figure it out. I'm a big girl. Okay. Sorry, you guys just caught my pep talk.
Alyssa, I can take the next slide to give you a second.
Great. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So now we have about 10 minutes left. Maybe 7 minutes left for questions, because we have a couple of things we really hope that you're able to stick around for 12 to 12:30 to talk more deeply about this. And so we'll talk about that transition in a second. But in the meantime, we'd like to open up the floor for a few questions, and know that hopefully we'll be able to dig more deeply into your questions during the breakout session. But we want you to really remember that if you feel that you feel disconnected from policy for a reason, it was designed that way, and it's designed to be confusing. It's designed to make us not feel like we can interact with our legislative process. And we really think it's time to whether it's take our power if we ever had power, it's time to take back our power, however you see it, so that we can be heard in Congress this time around. So also, Alyssa and I recognize, and that our other team, we're not experts on this. It is a giant bill that is very complicated. So we may be able to answer some of your questions today. If not, we're certainly happy to research together and look and dive deeper into the questions that you have.
Thank you, Emily. I really appreciate that. And thank you, Devin, for doing the hard work. So I never even had to do that.
So yeah, any questions that are coming up for folks right now?
Or anything you want a little bit more information about or to dig in on?
This is kind of a group question, but I was wondering if anyone had any any farm bill, this is silly, but if anybody had any farm bill books that they particularly loved or found useful, because I know that there's so much information that we can get collectively and share through discussion, but just kind of wondering if there's some learning that I could do on my own, and if anybody has like a really solid recommendation.
I don't have a book exactly, but we have our resource. So part of what we want to make sure that y'all know is accessible is that we've been working on this for only about 7 weeks, but we've been trying to build as many resources as possible as we can. And we definitely, if you're looking to organize in your communities, we want to make those resources accessible. We do have a spreadsheet with a lot of different articles and news bites and things like that to help put it together, that we're happy to share with anybody. If you just contact us, we have contact information on our last page. But we do have a lot of resources to share, not necessarily a book. I would still, if anybody crowdsourcing has a specific book, would love that too.
Yeah, I'm like, please, if you have any books, that would be great. Any other questions, or does anybody who is in here and works in policy have any great farm bill tea that we need to know?
Yeah, we love it. It's a lot about the tea, y'all.
It's mostly the tea. Yeah. Is tea covered? It is as a crop.
Specialty crop. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if there's not questions,
We got one more from Devin.
okay, great.
Yeah, I was just curious again, because we're going to do these breakout rooms so we can get some more FaceTime with each other. But while we're all together, I was just curious if anyone had thoughts or kind of ideas about how to not necessarily like break down, but think through what is kind of tends to get divided, which we're kind of doing here between ag and nutrition. Like there's a functional element of that, but how we can kind of like make sure that there's connections across those lines. And if anybody had kind of thoughts on that, because I've heard it in a couple of conversations that I've had where people are like, yeah, we end up kind of getting siloed, which is functional in some ways, and in other ways might kind of limit our building together, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, for me, how I sort of pitch it, that's not a great word, but it's the only word I can kind of think of, is, well, one, there are facts to back up the fact, that was a weird sentence, that a fair amount of farmers also are food insecure. A lot of farmers are also food insecure. So we are often talking about potentially the same group. And so how do we make sure that that's very clear, that the majority of farmers are food insecure, do have to have off-farm jobs. And so if that's the case, then seeing this as more holistic is helping everyone. So if we can help farmers, farmers can then help the community, and farmers are often the very community that needs to be helped. That was very circular, but I think that also sort of shows the circular nature of this. And that if we have stronger local food systems, then we will have sort of less of a need for SNAP and less of a need for these what should be emergency food systems that are now just how people are putting food on their table. So as we've seen over the past few years, because it's just been one crisis and one disaster after another, and I'm not sure that's going to stop. So how do we make sure that emergency food is in fact emergency food and not how people are just every day feeding themselves? And in order to do that, we need to shore up the food system in general. And that is on both sides.
Yeah, and I think the difficult part of this is the commodity lobby is really strong, because a lot of when we think about what our domestic food supply is, it's a lot of processed foods that are coming through commodity crops, and that is linked to a lot of like food access or food just distribution programs. So investing in local food systems, as Alyssa just articulated, does a lot for bridging that coalition and building it together, while at the same time beginning to disinvest from that commodity processed food vicious cycle. Yeah, Grace.
Yeah, I just have one more quick question, since that just made me, that conversation made me think about is, and maybe y'all already said something about this and I didn't catch it earlier, but are there, obviously this is like big transformational system change and takes a long time, but I'm just curious about the efforts that exist around trying to push how the current farm bill is like 99% commodity, or I don't remember what the number, but it's like most of it is commodity. And then there's like a teeny bit towards regenerative ag, or like, what do efforts look like to kind of shift that? And I know that the commodity lobby, and there's just like money and power involved in that side, but any thoughts on, what are some of those ongoing efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are so many, and what we can talk about this more in the ongoing, but I think there are so many efforts to think about how to, at least in commodity agriculture, begin to implement mandatory conservation bare minimums in order to receive funding. So I think beginning to push in right now, and it's happening a little bit more and more, and it's really great to see a lot of climate folks here on this call, because traditionally it's been like food access and nutrition folks and ag folks, and a lot of the conservation work is being done not necessarily in a visionary perspective, but bringing in more conservation and climate voices to this coalition, I think we'll have a really big opportunity to kind of to bust up the status quo, really. But that will be, bringing in those interests will be, I think, transformational to the Farm Bill. So glad you're here. Welcome.
Yes.
Thanks for joining the coalition.
Thank you. So we're right at around noon. And so if you are not able to stay for our breakout groups, totally understand. But please fill out the survey. And we hope that we are able to organize with you and to share more. We're going to do a Farm Bill 201 or something next as well, so that you can learn a little bit more, especially as we get a draft of the Farm Bill. And we'll be sending you some information as well.
Alyssa, can you
So-
go back to step 18
Yes.
to slide 18, because we didn't really get a chance to talk about kind of what we're doing. And
There you
kind
go.
of
Yes, thank you.
ground us into what we may want to be able to talk about in the next half hour. What Sprout and FPAC is working on doing is crafting a statewide response to what we want to see in a farm bill. So that's broken out into, so far, 3 kind of flexible strategies. Number 1 is building the network of stakeholders who want to speak out for the farm bill. And that's part of what is happening here, right? We got we're building our grassroots groups of what folks want to say by adding primers, and also we're going to and building out interest, seeing who's interested in doing this. Bucket 2 is that we're going to be connecting us all. Once we map out what are some of the solutions that are coming up nationally, we're going to kind of mirror that back to y'all and hold some listening sessions throughout the state and online to hear back from what you all want to see. And then we're going to synthesize that and try to look toward what policy platforms, what federal platforms and regional platforms may meet our values and advance our interests, and potentially be able to identify some gaps that are not being addressed through some of these national platforms. So as we're moving into our next conversation, what we'd love to do is both be able to hear back from what y'all are doing. We have so many people with a lot of experience in the room already, and start to sharing out what y'all are doing, and then begin to keep brainstorming about how we may build this coalition together to hear what we want to see.
Great. So we are going to break into breakout rooms. Devin has been working on organizing us, so she is going to assign us to a breakout room, and there will be facilitators in those rooms. When your breakout room is finished, you don't need to necessarily come back to the general room. You can go on your way, have your lunch, enjoy. But again, we really hope this is the start to a much larger coalition that will be advocating for a sound and just and equitable farm bill.